So the pandemic has revealed existing inequalities and exacerbated them further. Precarious workers, those with low skill, insecure jobs on the front line of the service economy, are facing the choice between losing their lives and losing their jobs, which is the only source of their income. The pandemic has also put on display our common humanity. There's plenty of French philosophers now writing about our common, rediscovering our humanity. As the virus is afflicting men and women, rich and poor, the young and the old, in different degrees, but still all of us. However, it is revealing a third feature of our societies, another type of precarity, which I describe as generalized social precarity, which is afflicting the 99%. This precarity has been politically engineered, politically crafted, and has been in the making for about 4 decades. It plays out differently for various groups, from the chronic unemployment of young people in Spain. The unemployment among the young in Spain is about 20%. So those who can never enter the labor market, on the one hand. On the other hand is the increased work pressures for the highly skilled workers who can never quit the treadmill because of job insecurity, even if they would prefer a better work-life balance. So the precarious situations of various groups, even class enemies, are linked in some way in this general social precarity, condition of precarity. So to put it in a nutshell, in a word, contemporary capitalism, I claim, has created not just a precarious class, a precariat, like the proletariat, as the economist Guy Standing has coined the word, but a precarious multitude. So my book addresses the nature and the sources of this condition and suggests some solutions. My conclusion is that although capitalism has performed rather well as an engine of material prosperity, as I reject the thesis about the crisis of capitalism, capitalism, I think, has been in good health, but as a social system, it has arrived at a very curious point in its life. Even for the winners of that game of production and unequal distribution of affluence, even for those who we so much envy, the highly educated, highly skilled, well-paid, or otherwise wealthy people, winning at that game starts to come at too high a price, the price of living a life they do not value. So the negatives outweigh the positives, the gains. In this way, capitalism has reached a point in its development where a coalition of very unlikely partners emerges, strange bedfellows indeed, who reject capitalism for a variety of reasons, often very conflicting reasons. Such a negative attitude to capitalism is unprecedented, and it is not conditioned on any crisis, I claim. It does not necessitate that we embrace any utopia such as socialism in order to go ahead, to press ahead with these grievances against capitalism. And its end would not come through a revolution, through a revolutionary break, but through a process I describe as subversion. Now, I can come back to that point later. Now, let me tell a little bit about the process of coming to these conclusions. The book has proven politically salient not only through the current health crisis that has revealed this precarity of our societies, the incapacity to to manage, not a very strange virus, in fact. So the precarity of our social system are playing out in the fact that there's not sufficient funding for our healthcare system, for instance. But it proved politically salient already before the pandemic hit. The European Greens in October or November, sometime in the fall, the coalition of green parties in the European Parliament became interested in one aspect of my argument, which is not even very prominent in the book, but namely that in order to reconcile the agenda of environmental justice with the agenda of social justice, we need to replace the current focus on growth and redistribution, through which social justice has been thought for a long time. Think tax the rich. I mean, if we want to tax the rich, we need to produce the wealth that we tax and then redistribute. So to replace that stress on growth and redistribution with a focus on fighting social precarity in the way I described, that massive generalized precarity, not just the precarity of the most poor parts of the population. So this has gained the interest of the green parties in Europe, because I claim only if we reconcile the social agenda with the environmental justice agenda, we can harness that broad societal support of the European Green Deal, or in the US is the new Green, the new Green Deal, that can push ahead with that. So we need a very broad societal alliance, and this is, I claim, the only way to achieve it. Now, let's enter into my kitchen, kind of intellectual kitchen, and see how I articulated these ideas. We as thinkers, as researchers, are inevitably affected by our biography. And it is a matter of intellectual honesty to be aware of how our biography, how our life trajectory affects our thinking, and disclose it to our readers. We inevitably are trapped in that, so all we can do is become aware and reveal, how we are affected by our biographies. And to me, it is very clear that my growing up under the socialist dictatorship in Bulgaria in the 70s and 80s has certainly affected my thinking. I was involved in the dissident movement in the late 1980s, when I was about your age, or even younger, in my first year of studies in the university in 87, I got involved with, rather inadvertently, but I will not give you that story now. You'll have to take me for drinks someday and I'll tell you that story, how I got involved with the dissidents. But then we were reading a lot Václav Havel. And one particular idea of Havel really stayed with me from those times. And this is Havel's, Václav Havel, the thinker, the one-time president, theater director, playwright. So it is his idea that capitalism and socialism have in fact much in common. That there are two articulations of the nefarious logic of technological modernity, Havel thought, which trap us in a process he called self-waste, samohab. So that intuition, that's very striking intuition, that capitalism and socialism do not form a neat dilemma. They are not opposites. They do not exhaust all the possibilities for a viable social organization. That remained very strongly with me from those times. Now, I left Bulgaria in the very early 90s. I went to do my PhD in New York. I studied at the New School. And of course, there my intellectual biography was very much linked with the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. But what brought back, and now at some point I relocated to Brussels, what brought back this early intuitions, this early interest into the commonality between capitalism and socialism and possible alternatives were conversations with my very young son. As soon as he could articulate a full sentence, so maybe at around age 4, he started asking me, Mama, what is better? What do you prefer, capitalism or socialism or communism? Yeah. And he pressed me to clarify. I was always, avoiding my answer. I was saying neither. But he kept pressing me with the years. Our conversations continued on that topic, and he wanted answers. So this is how, in a way, my book started shaping up. He's now 20, studies physics, but here's my second advice to you as young researchers. So the first is to be very honest about your intellectual and personal biography, how they frame your thinking. The second advice is, if you have young children, use them wisely in conversations. Okay, moving on to the initial process of writing the book. It is providing, my guess is that it is providing so politically relevant nowadays, probably because of the way it was immediately prompted. My immediate research for that book was initiated by an acute political puzzle, which was brought to me in 2003 by some members of the European Parliament from the radical left group, grouping in the Parliament. So at that time, the European elections were approaching, and these MEPs, members of the European Parliament, had noticed that left incumbents, that is the parties, the left parties that were in power at the time, had been losing power in the latest rounds of national elections, despite the fact that back then, so that was before the financial meltdown of 2008, we're talking early 21st century, they had done economically very well. The European economies were booming, and the American economy as well. There was solid growth, low unemployment. So how come, they were asking me, ruling left parties were being voted out of power despite their excellent economic performance? This was a surprise. So I was a young researcher at the time. They gave me some money. I started digging, started counting votes, starting looking at exit polls and whatever empirical data I could lay my hands on, and this is how I started, from just a very good political puzzle. So I started researching the matter and discovered 4 additional puzzles, which then steered further my research. Number 1, it was not simply that left parties were losing power, but also that new anti-establishment parties and movements emerged already back in the 1990s. So there's a lot of literature on populism, saying that, attributing populism to the impoverishment after the economic crisis of 2008. But this is not true. This is very short-term thinking. We need to dig back, further back, because parties like Pim Fortuyn list, the first Dutch far-right or populist movement it emerged before the economic crisis. So already in the late 90s. So something was going on additionally to the shift of the vote from the left to the right. There were these new anti-establishment partisan movements developing market in conditions and low unemployment. Usually populism emerges as a result of crisis, but that was not the case in the most recent mobilization of what is labeled populism. I do not like that label. So if you're familiar a little bit with my writing on populism, I advise against using that label. Okay, so that is the first additional puzzle. The second puzzle that I discovered was that in recent years, the language of social justice became that of anger against inequalities. Now, this is strange because capitalist societies have always been unequal, and there has been some sort of acceptance of these inequalities. So how come suddenly concerns with inequality became so dominant? You know, the 99%. There are institutes on inequality. People have made academic careers out of writing on inequality. Here, can I share my screen to show something? Let me see. Share screen. Here, this is can you see this is the poster in the Clarion Alley by Megan Wilson, the San Francisco artist. Here in 2011, she drew this poster.
It's not
Capitalism.
showing.
Can you see it?
I don't think so.
You cannot see it. Okay. I thought I'm sharing the screen. It doesn't work.
Probably you have security and.
Yeah. All right then. I'm just moving back to. How about now?
Yes. Now we can.
Yes, you can see?
Yes.
All right. Here is the poster of Megan Wilson. She drew it on the Clarion famous kind of wall art in San Francisco. Capitalism is over if you want it. This is 2011. In 2015, it was replaced with, this is in my book, wait, capitalism is over. Here is the new slogan. Tax the rich. Okay, now I need to go back here. Just to illustrate this obsession, I call it, with inequality. Now, I'm not saying that inequality is not a problem, but at that point, I take it as a symptom, simply because inequality has always been with us. Can you see me now? Are we back to normal? Okay. So inequality has always been with us. What I observe is upsurge, with a narrative about the unfairness of inequality. So I started suspecting, it's just one hypothesis, that the familiar language, the easily available language of the injustice of inequality is being used, simply because it is so easily available, is being used to express a new type of grievance. And I needed to find out what is this new grievance. Now that's the second puzzle. The third puzzle I discovered, because all great, good work starts with interesting research puzzles. The third puzzle was that 10 years after the onset of the financial crisis, the economy started improving. Yet society continued talking about itself as being in crisis. So the experiences of fragility, of dissatisfaction, of crisis continued. So the societal narrative about the reality we experienced was not about, oh, we're back to normal. Something that I later describe in the book as a crisis of the crisis, or a meta-crisis of capitalism. The fourth puzzle that I discovered is that despite the enormous damage done by the financial crisis, despite all the talk about societal malaise, unemployment, etc., with the exception of the Yellow Vests in France and the Occupy movements, which didn't last very long, the response of society was rather mild. So we were in crisis. We were all getting more insecure and more impoverished. But how come society was accepting this rather without much protest? I found that the protest was rather weak as compared to the, what we could expect. So this mild response of society was another puzzle. Also, in national elections around, in Europe, the vote in the course of these 10 years after the crisis systematically went to the center-right, shifted from the left to the center-right. Although the left expected that the crisis would radicalize the working class and will shift the vote to the left. So what was going on that the voters shifted either to the far right or to the center right rather than to the left. So here are four puzzles that pushed my thinking, fostered my thinking. And in order to solve those puzzles, I developed a model of analysis of capitalism and a theoretical framework for that analysis, stepping on what I knew, my schooling was in the Frankfurt School tradition of critical social theory, which I have reworked in order to adapt it to the analysis of contemporary capitalism. So first, I need to clarify, since capitalism would be my main object of critique, how I understand capitalism. Is it a market economy? Well, there have been a lot of market transactions throughout the history of mankind. We cannot just equate capitalism with the market economy. Can we just say that it is defined by the private property of the means of production, the most common definition of capitalism? I'm not quite satisfied with that. Of course, this is one element, but it is insufficient because the most important feature in the dynamics of capitalism is, in fact, the pursuit of profit. The organization of the means of production is just one way in which resources are deployed in the pursuit of profit, right? So I make the idea of the pursuit of profit central in the definition of capitalism and propose to describe capitalism as a system of social relations. So I kind of recover an original Marxian understanding of society, not in this structural functionalist understanding of system, but the Marxian understanding of society as a structured system of social relations, how people live together and create their life together. So I propose to think about what I call the repertoire, I don't know, I cannot find an English word for that, but repertoire of capitalism as a unity of the following core elements. So I propose, above all, we think about it as a systemic dynamic pertaining to the social system. So there are two of those. There is a constitutive dynamic, or what I call the operative logic, the competitive production of profit. So a lot of the consequences of the pursuit of profit have to do with the fact that it is through competition that we are pushing for the creation of profit. So the competitive production of profit is to me, I position as the main constitutive dynamic of capitalism. So there is three organizing principles: competition, profit making, and production. That is, the nature of work is not just creative. The nature of work is productivist. We need to, be productive as much as possible, right? Not just creative beings. So we engage in that process, we engage as labor used in the production of commodities. That is, commodity is a good or service explicitly produced for market exchange. And it gains value only to the extent that it can give us profit. Okay, so this is the constitutive dynamic that shapes notions of life chances, that is, for a successful life and accomplished self, before we start distributing the life chances. Okay, so this is, I said that systemic dynamics are two. The one is the constitutive, but there is another one. There's an enabling dynamic, and this is the dynamic of primitive appropriation. The appropriation of what is to be deployed later in the competitive pursuit of profit. So it can be nature, it can be, sexual life even. So whatever you appropriate in order to then push into the process of competitive production of profit. Okay, so we have these two systemic dynamics. And then capitalism also, in my understanding, has an internal structure, right? But I am very skeptical about using the word structure in this sense, as if there is something lurking underneath the surface, like globalization or something invisible. I'm afraid that if we speak about structure in this way, as whatever is invisible, we are reifying it. We're giving that thing a life of its own. So instead of just talking generally about structures, I talk about institutions with structuring effect. We can pinpoint at those institutions and the way they structure the interactions among people. So these institutions that help to enact the constitutive dynamic of the competitive production of profit are typically, no big mystery there, the private property and management of the means of production. It is just an institution with a structuring effect. Or things like the free labor contract, that is, everybody can enter that labor contract. That is also an institution with a particular structuring effect. So these institutions, they configure the social relations and then shape the distribution of life chances in society. So that's the second element in the analysis of capitalism. So first is the systemic dynamic, second is the internal structure with these structuring institutions, and third we have distributive outcomes. And I'm saying, when we say, oh, there is too much inequality, we are only paying attention to this third dimension, the distributive outcomes. But what we should be looking at are the structures and the systemic dynamics that are creating these particular distributive outcomes. So based on this three-dimensional analysis of capitalism, I also propose to think about a three-dimensional model of domination. And so I speak about relational domination, systemic domination, and structural domination, to add the normative aspect of my analysis on top of the descriptive part. So what is relational domination? It is whatever runs along the distribution of goods. They can be ideational goods, they can be prestige or recognition. So the relational domination consists in the subordination of one group of actors to another by force of the unequal distribution of power in society. Corresponding forms of injustice, what I call relational injustice or relative injustice, are typically inequality and exclusion. The typical remedies for inequality and exclusion is some sort of equalization strategies, right? Expanding the electoral franchise or the redistribution of wealth. Mind you, I don't claim that all inequalities engender relations of domination, but I'm saying that some relations of domination are simply about this unequal distribution of ideational or material resources. Okay, now apart from that, I speak about systemic domination. And this is the most important one for me. Systemic domination consists in the subjugation of all members of society to the systemic logic of the social system, including the winners in the asymmetrical distribution of power. So in capitalism, this domination is engendered by the imperative of competitive production of profit, to which also the owners and the managers of capital are subordinated, as well as the workers. So systemic injustice then has to do with social harm beyond the unequal distribution of social advantage and disadvantage. It is harm engendered by the very notion of what constitutes a social advantage, by the very ideal we have of successful life and the notion of accomplished self, and those in capitalism are linked to the competitive pursuit of profit. Thus, labor commodification, or treating a person's capacity to work as a good produced for market exchange, and alienation afflict all members of society who are engaged in some way in the process of competitive production of profit. So, the rich and the owners of capital are also victims of the system in that sense. The destruction of the environment is a form of harm that is suffered by the whole of humanity, be it in different degrees, but the ecological destruction, ecological damage is a sort of systemic injustice as well. And then we have the third form of domination, which is structural domination, which concerns the constraints on judgment and action. So how we are constrained in our judgment and action, that the main structuring institutions of the system impose on actors. Structural injustice then would consist in the incapacity of some actors to control the institutions through which the logic, or the key logic of capitalism plays out, which translates as their impotency to affect the rules of the game. A typical example in the case of capitalism is the exploitation of labor. So exploitation of labor is a form of structural injustice, while alienation would be a form of systemic injustice. See? So emancipation from structural injustice would necessitate the abolishment of the institutions which are causing it, right? Like the private property of the means of production. But even if we abolish the private property of the means of production and socialize, nationalize all property, we might still be engaged in the competitive pursuit of profit, like China is doing now. I mean, it is not dependent, that pursuit of profit is not dependent on the form of ownership of the means through which profit is generated. So it would not, that is why this might make my position rather scandalous from the point of view of left mobilization, but I find that nationalization of property would not do. We can discuss that further. So you see, I have this three-dimensional analysis model of capital, three trajectories of domination, and then according to the practices. So emancipatory practice in my analysis is an enduring pattern of activities or any social interactions that aim at the elimination of these three types of domination: systemic, structural, and relational domination. But I reserve the term practice only to the one that targets, that fights systemic domination. And this is my model of analysis of capitalism. However, I needed to complicate that model a little further, because otherwise I could not solve the puzzle of how come, people's lives are being wrecked, so systemic domination is all pervading, and yet people keep voting for the same political elites, center-right political elites that are the engineers of this domination. And therefore, I needed to articulate also a theory of legitimacy. Let me briefly map this out for you. I work with a few concepts, so I'm, of course, this is all in chapter 2 of the book, but to just sum it up, I speak about the legitimation matrix as a set of normative resources in society from which the legitimacy of the social order is sourced. The ground rules of fairness. This is a legitimation, I call it legitimation matrix. Composed of a set of broadly shared views about life chances. So what constitutes a life chance? Whether to become rich counts as a life chance, or to become free from work is a life chance. What society counts as things to go after? Life chance is a term I borrow from Weber, but also these life chances. This is what the legitimation matrix consists of: rules defining what are life chances and what is a fair distribution of these life chances. Now, I observe that since its inception, capitalism as a system of social relations has relied on the following ground rule to gain acceptance even in the eyes of the losers. So in an idealized market society, risks and opportunities are to be correlated for every participant. So the more we risk with investment, with exposure to all kinds of risks, the more we're entitled to gains. So that correlation between risk and opportunity, I claim, has been the essential rule that, on the basis of which capitalism has gained the acceptance of the broad acceptance and of even of the losers in this game. Then I have another concept, legitimacy deal, to capture something else, another aspect of legitimacy. This is a more narrow concept than the legitimacy matrix, and I use it to talk about the explicit relationship, legitimacy relationship between public authority and citizens. So it specifies, the legitimacy deal specifies which actions public authority is called on to perform for society in order to secure the fair distribution of life chances. What we can think about those things as political deliverables, what we want our governments to do to comply with this our understanding of what is a fair distribution of life chances. I draw on the work of Klaus Offet to articulate this bit of my theory. So the legitimacy deal alters when the legitimation matrix is threatened. So once there is a very big décalage, in French the word comes, discrepancy between risk and opportunity, then this basic rule of capitalism is being threatened. So the legitimacy deal between society and state kicks in, and the state is called on to do something to readjust this balance between opportunity and risk. So this enables considerable changes within any given social system, a lot of flexibility. So once I articulated these elements of analysis, then I went on to propose a certain methodology of critique, right? There's a difference between a theory, so these were my elements of theory, and then a methodology of how I proceed to deploy that theory in the analysis of something, in my case of contemporary capitalism. So I ask, what would it mean, in fact, to conduct a normative and a diagnostic analysis of our contemporary social and political order from the perspective of critical social theory? And I propose that we proceed from a specific grievance. This is our, what I call an empirical entry point of critique. Then I trace the manner in which grievances of injustice, expressed usually by civil society, affect the legitimacy matrix, or what is considered a relevant claim to justice, by making all these scattered concerns as politically salient in a particular way, that is having to do with the fair distribution of life chances as specified dominant legitimation matrix. So that's the second step. So I would scrutinize next in which grievances are asked. That is how they obtain political significance as claims to justice. This would allow me to ask what really stands behind our preoccupation with inequality. And then move on to policy action through which these grievances are addressed. How these grievances then affect the legitimacy deal between citizens and public authority. Then I suggest to move further the inquiry in the direction of the structural and systemic dynamics of the social order, because we always proceed from the easiest claims to detect. It's about distribution, about inequality, exclusion. But then we need to go further from the relational aspects of these battles onto the structural and to the systemic. Okay, so in order to get to the structural and systemic dynamics, I would seek to identify the antinomies or the contradictions of contemporary capitalism that foster a historically particular but structurally general experience of injustice, from which then I can formulate a normatively generalizable notion of justice. And so eventually this allowed me to move from the discourse of inequality, of the injustice of inequality, to a discourse about the general injustice of massive precarity. Okay, this is my model of kind of methodology, or how I go about it as I approach contemporary capitalism. I start empirically from the mobilization of populism, from the grievances of populist parties and movements, and then I eventually have a much more general and you know, maybe sweeping analysis of contemporary capitalism. So this eventually allows me to tell the following story of the historical transformation of capitalism since the 19th century. Oh, what time is it? Okay. So I've been speaking for a little less than an hour. Shall I continue with this? Yeah, I think I can wrap it up in 10 minutes. It would make sense to tell you how this model of capitalism allows me to tell a historical story about the evolution of capitalism. Okay, so I speak of not models of capitalism, but modalities of capitalism, according to the way this all the elements of capitalism find a new configuration, historical configuration of the repertoire of capitalism. So changes, I would claim, occur when new circumstances create new social opportunities and risk, or when the correlation between risks and opportunities is disturbed, or also when new public perceptions emerged about a fair distribution of life chances. So this is my definition of what pushes capitalism to pass from one modality to the next. And I articulate 4 such sequential modalities of capitalism, historical modalities of capitalism. So we have the liberal capitalism of the 19th century. Then we have the welfare capitalism for most of the 20th century. We have the neoliberal format in the 2 last decades of the 20th century. And finally, I say there is the contemporary model of capitalism. I call it precarity capitalism of the early 21st century, which shaped at the very beginning of the 21st century, much before the financial crisis, but the financial crisis helped it consolidate. It did not inaugurate this new form of capitalism, it helped it consolidate. And then I articulate a few features of this precarity capitalism. In earlier writing, I use different labels. I speak about reorganized capitalism in one of the first analyses I did it was published in Constellations in 2010. So I call this post-neoliberal capitalism reorganized. In another publication later, how did I call it? I forget, but I have zoomed in on precarity capitalism recently. So with apologies that I've been shifting this terminology, but it seems to me that this is the best term. Okay, so it is marked by the following 3 features. with regard to state-market relations, public authority protects not capitalism, the capitalist system generally, but it protects specific market actors. And it protects those market actors which can secure the competitiveness of the national economy in the globally integrated capitalist system. So there are examples in my book of how governments are creating these national champions in one way or the other, very often in violation of EU antitrust and anti-state aid legislation. But there is a push of national, with public money, in fact, to distribute resources towards those economic actors who already have advantage in the global economy. Okay, this is one of the features of precarity capitalism. The second feature concerns the state-society relations. The legitimacy deal, remember I spoke about a legitimacy deal as what public authority, what functions is public authority expected to perform. So the legitimacy deal excludes social responsibility. It excludes social responsibility not because people don't want a safety net. For something to become political deliverable, something that public authority should deliver to society, society has to both believe it is desirable, but also feasible to deliver. We might hold social security to be very highly desirable, but if we believe that in the conditions of global capitalism and all the competitive pressures of the global economy, if we believe that the state doesn't have the means to deliver the social safety, a robust social safety net, or good public services, we no longer request them. That is why a feature of the contemporary capitalism, I claim, is that the legitimacy deal has excluded the social responsibility of the state and has created this interesting configuration of a very powerful states that they can afflict a lot of social harm without being held responsible for that social harm. So that partially explains the puzzle of why people do not protest more than they should, why the protest has been rather taciturn. Like an example is take that beautiful slogan of the Spanish indignados. We are not against the system is against us. So they're pleading for a more inclusive system, but that's not very radical rejection of a unfair system, right? There's nothing very much revolutionary in that slogan. Okay, and the third feature of contemporary capitalism concerns the general state of society. There are two contradictions. Remember, I promised that eventually my analysis, starting from an empirical entry point, some grievance, I will dig into the main contradictions of capitalism. So the two contradictions that I discern, that I see, I call the first surplus employability. And this consists in the fact that simultaneously we see an increase in the decommodification potential of modern societies. Due to automation, due to scientific progress, we can produce our life with very little labor, right? Because technology allows with very little effort to produce a lot. But at the same time, commodification pressures have increased as well. So that's a contradiction. That is, we are all under pressure to be employed, to stay employed, and to make ourselves employable, although we can produce more of our necessities with less labor, right? So this is what I call surplus employability. And the second contradiction is the acute job dependency. What I mean here is that there is a tension between the decreased availability of good jobs, because with the globally integrated economy and with automation, there are less and less available good jobs, but we are all the more reliant, we have to rely more and more for our existence on such a job as a source of livelihood, especially as the social safety net is being thinned out, as supposedly there are no funds for it. So we increasingly depend for our life chances, for our life, on jobs that are disappearing. So this, in combination, these two contradictions of contemporary capitalism create this massive precarity that afflicts everybody, the rich and poor, the employed and the unemployed, the precariously employed, the stably employed, because in fact, everybody is facing this opportunity that the jobs would disappear or would become less available. And all of these, then that precarity has one root, and this is the competitive production of profit, the systemic imperative, the operative principle of capitalism. But we face the following conundrum. On the one hand, discontent with capitalism is at unprecedented levels. As I said, even those we most envy with the good, well-skilled, well-paid jobs, they are suffering from these permanent pressures. In the book, I use surveys showing that mental health disorders have increased exactly among this kind of the management social group, the owners and managers of capital. So even for these people, the competitive pressures of the global economy are creating aversion against the system. But insecurity makes people conservative. And this is especially the case. So see, there is an aversion. There is a massive, I think, unprecedented aversion, discontent with capitalism. But the key feature of contemporary capitalism, globalized precarity, is making everybody more conservative. And this is the case, especially when there is no plausible utopia to direct this discontent. And I do not think that socialism is nowadays a plausible utopia. I define myself as a liberal socialist, but my personal affinities do not matter. This experiment of Eastern Europe with whatever went under the label of socialism, really existing socialism, discredited the idea itself. So I think it discredited it so badly that, that it cannot perform that function of massive mobilization of this broad discontent with capitalism. So the anti-capitalist mood cannot be properly fully mobilized through the idea of socialism because of what the damage done by the failure of the socialist experiments in Eastern Europe. Okay, so what do we do with the absence of such positive utopia? As I said, not only because of that, remember Václav Havel, I think he was very right there that socialism was terrible for the environment. So the fact that we might own the means of production collectively is not a guarantee that we would not continue in this game of competitive production of profit as we as we compete, let's say, with the likes of China for, you know, jobs and markets. So we need to approach the possibility of radical change differently, because I believe that this massive discontent with capitalism it gives an incredible opportunity. But my strategy is, I call that subverting rather than overthrowing capitalism, so that we can use the available mechanisms, even private property of the means of production, to go against the very logic of the competitive production of profit. Because as long as we keep our energy on fighting the competitive production of profit, and there are many ways of doing that, we will gradually subvert capitalism. That's my bet. I have articulated my program. Of course, you know, I have also a set of policies in Untitled Chapter 6. I call them political economy of trust. I'm open for other suggestions. This is just one way to illustrate what I mean by focusing our efforts on anything that can fight the competitive production of profit. So this is my story. Yeah, I still have energy to answer some questions. So.